By the spring of 1945, the war no longer moved in clear lines. Along the northern European coastline, German naval installations still existed on paper, but command authority had fractured into confusion, contradiction, and silence. Orders arrived late if they arrived at all. Some were relayed by radio operators who no longer knew which headquarters still existed. Others came by courier, unsigned, stamped with outdated seals. No one could tell which commands were real and which were echoes of a state already collapsing. The officer was stationed at one of these coastal posts, a modest naval facility carved into cliffs overlooking cold, gray water. It was not a glamorous command. No large warships docked there in 1945. Its purpose had been surveillance, coastal defense, and maintaining control of nearby sea lanes earlier in the war. By April, it was mostly forgotten. The men under his authority were exhausted, underfed, and aware that the war was lost, even if no one was allowed to say it out loud. Radio traffic from Berlin had become erratic. Some days there were frantic transmissions ordering all remaining forces to hold their positions to the last man. Other days brought messages urging commanders to destroy sensitive equipment and prepare to withdraw. One message referenced an evacuation that never arrived. Another demanded continued resistance, citing honor and duty, even as Allied forces advanced hundreds of kilometers closer each week. The officer was known as disciplined and methodical. He had risen through the Navy quietly, without reputation for cruelty or fanaticism. Those who served under him later described him as distant but precise, a man who followed procedures even when they made little sense. He rarely spoke about ideology. He spoke about tides, supply inventories, patrol schedules. When morale collapsed around him, he did not join the despair or the bravado. He simply kept working. By late April, surrender had become an unspoken certainty among the men. Nearby units were laying down arms. White flags appeared at coastal outposts only days' marches away. Some officers deserted in civilian clothing. Others shot themselves. The officer did neither. He continued to report for duty, continued to review charts, continued to listen to the radio, even as its static grew heavier and its messages more desperate. On April 28, a transmission came through ordering all remaining naval officers to destroy classified materials and prepare to move inland for reassignment. Less than 12 hours later, a second message arrived instructing coastal commanders to hold their positions and deny access to Allied forces at all costs. The messages contradicted each other completely. Both were formatted correctly. Both carried authentication codes. No clarification followed. That night, witnesses later recalled, the officer requested access to the map room after curfew. This was unusual but not forbidden. Several sailors saw him studying coastal charts, the kind used for small craft navigation rather than large naval movements. He removed several documents and placed them into a weathered rucksack. No one questioned him. Rank still mattered, even at the end. In the early hours before dawn, a sentry saw him walking alone toward the perimeter path that led away from the base and down toward the cliffs. He was dressed in standard naval attire without insignia. He carried the rucksack and nothing else. No vehicle was taken. No farewell was given. At the time, it did not seem remarkable. Many officers were leaving. Many never came back. By morning, the base was in chaos. Another radio order arrived instructing all personnel to surrender to advancing Allied forces. White flags were raised. The men gathered, exhausted, relieved, and afraid. When names were called, the officer did not answer. At first, it was assumed he had already left under orders. Then it was assumed he had deserted. No one filed a report. There was no protocol for missing officers in a war that was ending by the hour. Days later, Allied troops arrived and took control of the installation. They cataloged equipment, interviewed remaining personnel, and processed surrender paperwork. When asked about commanding officers, the men gave the officer's name and rank. Allied clerks searched their lists. His name did not appear among captured personnel. They assumed he had fled inland earlier and would be processed elsewhere. He never was. In the weeks that followed, the Allied occupation authorities compiled extensive records of surrendered German military personnel. Camps were organized, interrogations conducted, medical examinations logged. The officer's name did not appear on any POW roster, nor did it appear on casualty lists. No body was recovered. No report of death was filed. Administratively, he simply vanished. At first, this meant little. Tens of thousands were unaccounted for in the immediate aftermath of the war. Records were incomplete, borders were shifting, entire units had disintegrated. But as months turned into years, the absence grew harder to explain. Other officers from the same base were eventually accounted for. Some were released from captivity, others died in camps. Their paperwork existed, his did not. Inquiries were minimal. The new German authorities were overwhelmed. Allied investigators prioritized war crimes and reconstruction. A single missing naval officer did not register as urgent. His family, if they searched, left little record. His personnel file was incomplete, marked with administrative notes that led nowhere. Status unknown became the final entry. Yet small details lingered. The night he left, the charts he carried, the fact that he did not attempt to blend into civilian life, at least not from the base itself, and the location of the post, isolated along a rugged stretch of coastline filled with inlets, caves, and narrow paths known only to locals and sailors. Some of the men who surrendered later spoke privately about it. They remembered how calm he seemed in those final days, how he warned them not to wander near certain coves after dark, citing unexploded ordnance. At the time, it sounded like a safety reminder. Later, it felt more like a warning. The mystery did not announce itself dramatically. There was no last stand, no wreckage, no final transmission. Just an officer who walked away from a collapsing war and was never seen again. In the chaos of surrender, he became an error of omission, a blank space in a ledger meant to record the end of one of history's deadliest conflicts. But blank spaces have a way of attracting attention over time. As archives were revisited and local histories compiled, his absence began to stand out, not as tragedy but as anomaly. A man trained for the sea, stationed at the edge of it, who did not surrender, did not die, and did not return. And somewhere along that coast, long after the war officially ended, there were places no one went, paths no one used, and questions no one asked out loud. Because the war was over, and everyone was supposed to move on, even as one man's story refused to close. In the years immediately after the war, Allied administrators worked methodically through mountains of German military records. The process was slow but deliberate. Units were cross-checked. Names were reconciled against surrender documents, death certificates, hospital logs, and prisoner transfers. It was tedious work meant to close the book on a shattered military machine. For the coastal unit where the officer had served, the results were unusually clear. Every enlisted man was accounted for. Every subordinate officer had a documented outcome. Some were dead, some captured, some discharged into a defeated civilian population. Only one name remained unresolved. At first, it appeared to be a clerical oversight. Files from 1945 were notoriously incomplete. Entire offices had been burned or abandoned. But when investigators pulled secondary records, pay logs, duty rosters, promotion lists, the same absence appeared again and again. His service record ended abruptly in late April 1945. No surrender date, no death notation, no transfer. It was as if he had stepped out of the system before it could record his exit. That absence drew quiet attention among Allied intelligence officers tasked with naval affairs. German naval personnel were of particular interest because of their technical knowledge and potential involvement in clandestine operations. U-boat commanders, radar specialists, and coastal defense officers were often scrutinized closely. A man who vanished at the precise moment of surrender raised questions, even if no immediate answers followed. Investigators began reconstructing his background from fragments. He had joined the Navy well before the war's final years, trained extensively in coastal navigation and maritime logistics. His evaluations described him as precise, reserved, and highly competent. He was trusted with sensitive installations and classified materials. Unlike some of his peers, there were no disciplinary issues, no records of ideological zealotry, and no documented conflicts with superiors. He was neither a fanatic nor a dissenter. He was, according to those who served under him, someone who kept things compartmentalized. That tendency toward secrecy became more apparent as interviews were conducted. Surviving sailors recalled that he rarely explained his reasoning. Orders were given without context, justified as operational necessity. He maintained strict control over access to maps, radios, and supply inventories. This was not entirely unusual for a wartime officer, but the consistency of it stood out. He trusted procedures more than people. When Allied investigators spoke to local civilians near the former base, the picture grew stranger. Fishermen and villagers described the officer as polite but distant. He had warned some of them during the final months of the war to avoid certain stretches of coast, claiming they were mined or unsafe. No such warnings were issued by other officers. After the war, when locals returned to those areas, no mines were found. More unsettling were the rumors that surfaced only years later. Some villagers claimed to have seen a small boat moving along the coast at night in the weeks after the surrender, without lights, hugging the shoreline. Others recalled supplies going missing from abandoned naval stores, food tins, fuel canisters, medical kits. No thefts were officially recorded. In the chaos of occupation, losses were common, but the pattern suggested intention rather than looting. Former sailors, interviewed decades later, admitted that certain supplies had been removed shortly before surrender, signed out under vague justifications. At the time, they assumed it was routine destruction or relocation. Only in hindsight did it seem deliberate. The quantities were modest but practical, enough to sustain one person for a prolonged period if used carefully. Investigators began to consider a possibility that had once seemed unlikely. The officer may not have been a casualty of chaos. He may have made a choice. Psychologically, the theory made an uncomfortable kind of sense. Many German officers feared surrender deeply. Some expected execution. Others feared imprisonment or disgrace. For naval officers, whose identities were tied closely to discipline and hierarchy, the collapse of command could feel like personal annihilation. For a man trained to operate independently along hostile coastlines, disappearing may have felt more controllable than surrendering to an uncertain fate. There was no evidence he planned to flee abroad, no passport records, no sightings inland, no financial trail. That absence suggested something more contained, not escape in the conventional sense but withdrawal. The geography supported the theory. The coastline near his post was rugged and sparsely populated. Steep cliffs concealed narrow coves accessible only by foot or small craft. During the war, the area had been surveyed extensively by the Navy. He would have known it better than almost anyone. He would have known where to hide, where fresh water could be collected, where storms made approach dangerous. Yet there was no direct proof. No eyewitness placed him definitively after surrender. The night boat sightings were anecdotal. The missing supplies could not be conclusively tied to him. Every piece of evidence was circumstantial, fragile on its own, but together they formed a pattern that refused to disappear. As years passed, the case drifted from official concern into historical curiosity. But among those who studied wartime disappearances, his name became a reference point. Not for what was known, but for what was missing. He did not fit the profile of a deserter trying to blend into civilian life. He did not fit the profile of a fugitive fleeing justice. He fit something quieter and more unsettling, a man who chose isolation over submission. That possibility reframed everything about his disappearance. If he planned to vanish, then the lack of records was not an accident. It was the result. The silence was intentional. And if that was true, then the question was no longer whether he survived the end of the war, but how long he intended to remain hidden, and whether the coastline itself still carried traces of a life deliberately erased from history. By the early 1950s, the official trail had gone quiet. Allied occupation forces withdrew, new governments took shape, and the urgent work of rebuilding replaced the slow accounting of missing men. Files related to the officer were archived with a simple designation that carried no emotion and invited no follow-up. Unresolved. Incomplete. No further action required. His disappearance, once an anomaly, was absorbed into the broader fog of a war that had produced millions of missing names. But along the coastline where he had last been seen, the story did not end so cleanly. It changed form. Villages returned to a kind of uneasy normalcy. Fishermen went back to the water. Children played near cliffs once fortified with guns, yet certain places were avoided. A cove where nets kept snagging on something unseen. A narrow path along the rocks that older men warned others not to use. When asked why, the answers were vague. Dangerous terrain, old war debris, bad luck. In the late 1940s, a handful of fishermen reported hearing warning shots fired from shore during night tides. No one was injured. No one was caught. Local police logged the complaints and attributed them to smuggling operations, which were common in the immediate post-war years. Fuel, food, and alcohol moved quietly along the coast under cover of darkness. It was easier to blame criminals than resurrect the ghost of a war officer no one wanted to remember. There were reports of lights, too, flickers along the cliff face during storms, when no homes stood there and no boats should have been out. Some claimed the lights moved, appearing in one cove one night and another the next. Others said they stayed fixed, glowing dimly and then vanishing without explanation. Police dismissed these as reflections, lanterns, or imagination amplified by weather and memory. The caves were a recurring detail. Children dared each other to approach them during the day, only to find crude barriers blocking the entrances, boards, wire, sometimes stones stacked deliberately. Adults removed some of these obstructions over the years, but others reappeared, repaired, or replaced without explanation. No one ever admitted to doing it. Occasionally, authorities conducted cursory inspections. A patrol would walk the cliffs, peer into accessible caves, and leave. The terrain was dangerous, the resources limited, and there was no clear reason to invest further effort. Whatever had happened during the war was assumed to have ended with it. The idea that someone might still be there or had been there long after was quietly dismissed as impossible. As decades passed, the officer's identity eroded. His name faded from memory, replaced by something less precise. People spoke of a German, a naval man, a ghost from the war. The specifics blurred, but the unease remained. Stories were told in fragments, rarely written down, often contradicted. Each retelling stripped away detail and added uncertainty. Bureaucratically, his case was finished. There were no living witnesses willing to testify, no evidence that met modern standards, no incentive to reopen a file from a defeated army in a war everyone wanted to forget. The disappearance existed only as a footnote in archives few people ever accessed. Yet the rumors persisted because they filled a silence. The war had ended abruptly but not cleanly. Many questions had been buried along with the past, and the coastline carried those questions differently. It was a place shaped by concealment, by structures built to be hidden and then abandoned. The idea that something, or someone, had been left behind did not feel entirely unreasonable to those who lived there. By the 1970s and 1980s, the stories had lost urgency but gained a kind of permanence. They were told the way local legends are told, without insistence and without conclusion. No one expected answers. The officer was no longer a man who vanished. He was a symbol of a war that refused to fully release its grip on the landscape. Then quietly, interest returned. In the early 2000s, historians and amateur researchers began revisiting overlooked wartime disappearances, aided by newly declassified documents and digital archives. The officer's name surfaced again, not because of new evidence, but because of how little there was. His absence stood out in an era when gaps could be cross-referenced and anomalies flagged. Researchers traveled to the coast, spoke with aging villagers, and compared notes. Individually, the stories meant little. Together, they suggested continuity. Someone had been there after the war. Someone had taken care to remain unseen. Someone had known the land well enough to avoid detection for years, perhaps longer. The idea was unsettling, but it was no longer dismissed outright. Advances in archaeology, forensic science, and historical investigation made it possible to test what had once been speculation. And the coastline itself, shaped by erosion and time, began to reveal what it had hidden. What had been rumor was on the verge of becoming something else. Not proof, not yet, but the possibility that the officer's disappearance was not just a missing record, but a deliberate act that left traces still waiting to be uncovered. The discovery did not begin with a search for a missing officer. It began, as many buried histories do, with land changing shape. In the early 2020s, a private landowner commissioned a routine geological survey along a stretch of coastline long considered unstable. Winters had grown harsher. Storm surges were stronger, waves carving away at rock faces that had stood mostly unchanged for decades. A recent landslide had exposed unfamiliar stonework beneath layers of collapsed rock, and the surveyors were asked to assess whether further erosion posed a risk to nearby property. What they found did not look natural. Behind the fallen stone, partially sealed by rubble and vegetation, was a recessed opening cut cleanly into the cliff face. Its edges were straight, its angles deliberate. This was not a cave formed by water and time. It was carved. Reinforced concrete framed the entrance, heavily weathered but unmistakable. Someone had built this and built it to last. Local authorities were notified, initially under the assumption that it might be an undocumented wartime structure. Coastal defenses from the Second World War were still being discovered across Europe, many forgotten or poorly recorded. But when access was cleared and the opening widened, it became clear this was something different. Inside, the structure extended deeper than expected. A narrow corridor led into a chamber carved directly into bedrock, reinforced at key points with concrete and steel supports. The space was small but carefully organized. This was not a bunker meant for a garrison. It was designed for one person, maybe two at most. Along the walls were rusted fixtures, hooks, shelves, brackets where equipment had once been secured. In one corner, remnants of a crude sleeping platform. Nearby, empty crates stacked deliberately, their markings faint but still legible. German naval insignia, serial numbers consistent with late-war supply stock. The most striking find lay spread across a stone surface near the back of the chamber. A hand-drawn tide chart, preserved surprisingly well given the damp environment. The notation was precise, technical, and unmistakably German naval standard. Dates corresponded to 1945. Tidal cycles were marked not just for days, but for specific hours, annotated with notes about currents and weather patterns. For historians who were brought in shortly after, the implications were immediate and unsettling. This was not an emergency shelter hastily constructed during retreat. This was a planned hideout. Someone had invested time, resources, and knowledge into creating a place that could remain hidden from both land and sea. Forensic teams began a meticulous examination. Every object was cataloged. Food tins were counted, their labels degraded but identifiable. Many were military issue, others civilian, suggesting resupply over time. The quantities were telling, not stockpiled in bulk but replenished periodically, enough to sustain someone living carefully, rationing, planning ahead. A rudimentary ventilation system had been carved into the rock, disguised externally to blend with natural fissures. Airflow tests showed it was functional, even decades later. Freshwater collection was equally deliberate. Channels cut into stone directed rainwater into a concealed basin, filtered through layers of gravel and cloth remnants. This was survival engineering, not improvisation. No human remains were found. No clothing beyond fragments of fabric too degraded to identify conclusively. No personal letters. No diary. Whoever lived here took care not to leave behind the kinds of traces that would explain him. Yet the wear patterns told their own story. The floor was smoothed in specific paths. Fixtures showed repeated use. Tools, though rusted, were arranged with order rather than abandonment. This was a place that had been lived in, not merely occupied briefly. Carbon dating of organic material suggested use extending well beyond the immediate post-war years. Not decades, but long enough to challenge assumptions. Months became implausible. Years became possible. When news of the discovery became public, the old rumors resurfaced almost overnight. Villagers recognized the location immediately. This was one of the coves people avoided, the cliff face where lights had been reported. The area fishermen swore someone had guarded long after the war ended. Investigators cross-referenced the hideout's location with wartime maps and naval records. It lay precisely within the patrol and observation zone overseen by the missing officer. The tide charts matched his training. The supplies matched what had gone missing. The warnings he'd given civilians now sounded less like generic caution and more like deliberate misdirection. The case changed status quietly but fundamentally. What had once been speculation was now evidence. The officer had not simply vanished. He had prepared. Experts debated motive. Some argued he intended to hide only until surrender terms stabilized, then re-emerge. Others believed he planned to remain unseen indefinitely, unwilling to face captivity or the moral reckoning of defeat. Psychological profiles emphasized his methodical nature, his comfort with isolation, his trust in systems over people. Living alone in a controlled environment may have felt safer than surrendering to chaos. But one question eclipsed all others. If he survived here, even for a few years, how did it end? There were no signs of violence, no evidence of collapse or sudden abandonment. The hideout appeared orderly, almost respectfully closed. Supplies dwindled gradually rather than abruptly. It was as if whoever lived there left deliberately or simply faded away without disturbance. The discovery did not solve the mystery, it sharpened it. The officer was no longer a rumor or a missing record. His absence had a physical anchor now, carved into stone beneath a coastline that had kept his secret for nearly 8 decades. Investigators had proof of intent, proof of survival beyond the war's end, but still no proof of fate. And as the findings circulated through academic journals and quiet online forums, a more unsettling realization took hold. If one man could disappear this completely, with planning and patience, then the boundary between documented history and lived reality was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The hideout stood as evidence not just of survival but of choice. A place where the war did not end in May 1945 but continued in isolation, measured by tides and silence. And somewhere beyond those stone walls, the story still waited for its final chapter, whether it ended in death, escape, or something no record ever captured. As investigators spent more time inside the structure, the scale of intention became harder to ignore. This was not the kind of place a man stumbled into and adapted over time. The angles of the walls, the placement of the ventilation shafts, even the way supplies were stacked all suggested forethought. Someone had envisioned living here before the war reached its final collapse. Someone had planned for solitude. Detailed analysis of the naval crates revealed something else. Several bore markings indicating they had been diverted from official supply chains months before Germany's surrender. These were not items scavenged after defeat. They had been secured while the chain of command still existed, quietly removed without triggering alarms. That meant access, authority, and a window of time when disappearance could be prepared under the cover of routine operations. Investigators reconstructed how the hideout might have functioned day to day. The entrance, concealed behind movable rock and debris, would have been nearly invisible from the sea, especially during rough weather. From land, the approach required navigating a narrow path exposed to wind and spray, dangerous enough to discourage casual exploration. At night, access by small boat was possible only during specific tidal conditions that matched the handwritten chart almost exactly. The chart itself became a focal point. Experts noted annotations that went beyond basic navigation. There were symbols indicating sound travel across water, likely used to judge how far engine noise might carry. Other markings corresponded with moon phases and cloud cover, suggesting careful planning around visibility. This was the work of someone who expected to remain hidden, not briefly, but consistently. The absence of personal items troubled forensic teams. There were no photographs, no identification tags, nothing sentimental. It suggested either extreme discipline or deliberate erasure. One analyst noted that soldiers who plan to return usually leave something behind, even unconsciously. Those who do not expect to return often leave nothing. So where was he? Searches expanded beyond the bunker itself. The surrounding coastline was scanned using ground-penetrating radar where feasible. Accessible caves were examined for secondary shelters or burial sites. Nothing conclusive was found. The terrain was unforgiving, limiting how much could be safely explored. Large sections of cliff face remained inaccessible without risking lives, even with modern equipment. Some investigators proposed that the hideout may not have been the only one. Wartime engineering manuals described modular coastal shelters designed to be replicated discreetly. If he had built one, he could have built others, or at least identified fallback locations. The bunker beneath the cliffs may have been a base rather than a final refuge. Carbon dating of soot residues from a small fire pit suggested intermittent use rather than continuous habitation. Fires had been lit, extinguished, then relit weeks or months later. This pattern hinted at movement. Whoever lived here may have left for periods of time, returning only when conditions allowed. That possibility aligned with earlier rumors of night boats and disappearing lights. If he left the hideout alive, where did he go? The sea offered one answer, but not an easy one. Coastal waters were heavily monitored in the immediate post-war years. Smuggling routes existed, but they were dangerous and unreliable. Yet small craft could move unnoticed during storms, especially if guided by someone who knew the currents intimately. Still, there was no evidence he reached another country. No records surfaced of a man matching his description turning up elsewhere under a false identity. The land offered another possibility, though equally uncertain. Inland movement would have required contact with civilians, exposure, and risk. The hideout's design suggested avoidance rather than integration. Everything about it implied a man who trusted isolation more than people. As the investigation deepened, a quiet tension emerged among experts. The evidence supported survival but not resolution. The hideout answered the question of whether he vanished intentionally. It did not answer how or if it ended. Public interest grew steadily but cautiously. This was not a sensational discovery. There were no remains, no dramatic artifacts. Instead, there was a space, empty but purposeful, that forced a reconsideration of how history accounts for individuals who choose not to be counted. Local residents, some now in their 80s and 90s, were interviewed again. This time, they spoke more openly. With the bunker confirmed, old hesitations faded. Several recalled encounters they had once dismissed as tricks of memory. Footsteps near the cliffs long after curfew laws had ended, the faint smell of smoke on nights when no one else was nearby, a feeling of being watched that lingered long after the war was supposed to be over. One fisherman admitted he believed for years that someone was still living along the coast into the early 1950s. He never reported it because there was nothing concrete to report. No face, no name, just the sense that the war had not fully left. Authorities resisted drawing conclusions. Official statements emphasized caution, uncertainty, and the absence of definitive proof, but privately many acknowledged the same thing. The hideout was real, the planning was undeniable, and the timeline no longer ended in 1945. The officer had survived the war's end. Of that, investigators were now confident. What remained unknown was whether he survived the choice he made afterward. The bunker beneath the cliffs did not feel abandoned in the way forgotten structures usually do. It felt concluded, as if someone had closed a chapter carefully, leaving no loose ends behind. That, more than anything else, unsettled those who studied it. Because if the hideout was not abandoned in panic or death, then the man who built it may have walked away on his own terms, leaving behind only stone, silence, and a question history was never prepared to answer. And with that realization, the investigation moved into its most difficult phase. Not the search for proof of survival, but the attempt to understand how long a man can live outside the world before he disappears from it completely. Once the existence of the hideout was confirmed, the investigation shifted away from discovery and toward endurance. The question was no longer whether someone had lived there, but how long and at what cost. To answer that, investigators brought in specialists whose work rarely overlaps: military survival instructors, forensic archaeologists, naval historians, and psychologists who studied isolation under extreme conditions. Each approached the bunker not as a mystery, but as a system designed to keep a human being alive. From a purely logistical standpoint, the structure was effective. Survival experts noted that the bunker solved the three primary threats of long-term isolation: exposure, dehydration, and detection. The rock provided insulation against temperature extremes. The ventilation shafts, though narrow, were sufficient to prevent carbon monoxide buildup from controlled fires. The rainwater collection system, primitive but deliberate, could sustain a single person indefinitely during wetter seasons, provided it was maintained. Food was more complex. The tins found inside suggested an initial stockpile that could last several months if rationed aggressively. But carbon dating and corrosion analysis showed a range of manufacturing dates, indicating that supplies had been replenished over time. This was not a one-time hoard. Someone had returned with food again and again. That realization unsettled investigators. Periodic resupply implied movement. Movement implied risk, and risk implied either desperation or help. Historians examined post-war conditions along the coast. In the late 1940s, scarcity was widespread. Food was rationed. Fuel was precious. Locals struggled to survive themselves. The idea that civilians might have knowingly aided a former German officer was uncomfortable but not impossible. Survival often overrode politics in those years. Quiet exchanges, unspoken arrangements, or simple acts of fear-driven cooperation could not be ruled out. Yet no one ever admitted to helping him. Interviews produced denials, shrugs, and long silences. Some villagers insisted they had known nothing. Others said it was better not to ask questions at the time. The war had taught them that curiosity could be dangerous. Another theory suggested the officer did not rely on others at all. He may have left the hideout periodically, scavenging abandoned military depots, trading with smugglers, or even venturing inland under cover of night. The tide chart annotations supported this. They showed windows not just for arrival, but for departure, mapped carefully to avoid patrols and maximize darkness. Still, each excursion would have increased the chance of exposure. Yet there were no confirmed sightings, no arrests, no reports that could be tied to him definitively. If he moved through the world, he did so like a shadow. Forensic archaeologists focused on what was missing as much as what was found. There were no burial sites near the bunker, no human remains concealed nearby, no evidence of sudden death. If he died there, his body was not left behind. That absence pointed away from accidental death or suicide within the hideout. The interior conditions suggested something else. Supplies diminished gradually. Equipment was cleaned and stored. Trash was minimal. Nothing indicated panic or collapse. This was not the end of a man overwhelmed by circumstances. It looked more like the end of a chapter. Psychologists brought into the case were cautious. Survival in isolation is not just about food and shelter. It is about the mind. Studies of long-term isolation, from polar expeditions to solitary confinement, show predictable patterns: disrupted sleep, heightened vigilance, paranoia, emotional flattening. People either deteriorate rapidly or adapt by imposing rigid routines. The officer's personality profile suggested he belonged to the latter category. He was disciplined, procedural, comfortable with silence. His training would have reinforced routine as a coping mechanism: tides instead of clocks, inventories instead of conversations, purpose reduced to survival itself. But even the most resilient individuals reach limits. Without human contact, identity erodes. Survival becomes maintenance, not living. Experts agreed on one point: if he stayed for years, the psychological toll would have been severe. The hideout could keep him alive, but it could not keep him whole. That distinction mattered. Investigators debated whether survival was ever meant to be permanent. One theory proposed that the hideout was a temporary refuge, a place to wait until surrender terms stabilized or authorities moved on. But if that was the case, why not emerge later? Why not accept amnesty when it became available? By the early 1950s, former officers were reintegrating into civilian life across Europe. The absence of a reappearance suggested a harder truth. He may not have believed there was a place for him anymore. Survival did not lead back to society. It replaced it. Another possibility lingered at the edge of the discussion. He may have left intentionally, choosing a final departure that left no trace. The sea, after all, erases evidence efficiently. An experienced naval officer would know how to disappear into it completely. But there was no proof of that either. As months of analysis turned into years, investigators found themselves confronting an uncomfortable reality. The tools of modern science could measure duration, infer behavior, and reconstruct logistics, but they could not resolve intention. The hideout showed how long a man could survive. It did not explain why he stopped. The case file grew thicker, but the ending remained thin. No death certificate, no grave, no testimony, just a space where life had been sustained carefully, quietly, and then withdrawn. In the end, experts reached a cautious consensus. The officer survived the war by months at minimum and likely by years. He did so deliberately, competently, and alone. What followed was not a failure of survival skills, but a choice no evidence could fully explain. The hideout answered the practical question of how. It left untouched the human question of whether survival, stripped of connection and future, still counted as escape. And with that unresolved tension, the investigation approached its final reckoning, not with proof of an ending, but with the unsettling possibility that the officer had lived long enough to decide when his story would stop being written at all. By the time the investigation reached its final phase, there was a quiet understanding among those involved that the case would not end the way most histories prefer. There would be no confirmation of death, no recovered remains, no final document that closed the file cleanly. What had been uncovered beneath the cliffs was enough to prove intention, preparation, and survival, but not enough to explain how or when it ended. The hideout was indisputable. Its construction, supplies, and modifications confirmed that the officer had not simply fled in panic. He had chosen his disappearance. He had prepared for it with the patience and precision of someone who expected to be alone for a long time. In that sense, the mystery was solved. The man did not surrender because he never intended to. What could not be solved was the fate of that choice. No death record surfaced in any archive, German or Allied. Extensive searches through post-war civil registries, immigration records, and name change documents produced nothing credible. There was no evidence he lived under another identity, at least not one that could be traced. If he entered civilian life, he did so without leaving a bureaucratic footprint, an extraordinary feat in the modern era, but not impossible in the shattered landscape of post-war Europe. Investigators revisited every plausible ending. Accidental death near the hideout seemed unlikely. The terrain was dangerous, but the absence of remains or disturbance suggested otherwise. Suicide was considered, but again, no physical evidence supported it. There was no weapon found, no signs of trauma, no personal effects left behind in a way that suggested finality. The sea remained the most compelling and the most elusive possibility. As a naval officer, he would have understood the risks and the certainty it offered. A departure by water could erase him completely, especially if undertaken far from shore. Yet even this theory felt incomplete. There were no damaged boats, no debris, no eyewitnesses. If he chose the sea, he did so with the same care he applied to everything else. Another possibility, less dramatic but equally unsettling, was that he simply walked away. By the early 1950s, Europe was rebuilding itself rapidly. Millions were displaced. Records were inconsistent. People reinvented themselves out of necessity. It is possible the officer waited until attention faded, then left the coast quietly, blending into a world that was no longer asking questions about who anyone had been during the war. In such a world, silence could be enough. But this, too, remained speculation. What the investigation ultimately produced was not an answer but a boundary, a clear point where documentation ends and inference begins. Before the discovery of the hideout, the officer's disappearance could be dismissed as a wartime error, a lost record among countless others. After the discovery, that dismissal was no longer possible. He had stepped deliberately out of the war and into something else. That distinction matters. History is built on endpoints, dates of surrender, declarations of victory, lists of the dead. They give shape to events too large to comprehend otherwise. But the officer's story resisted that structure. His war did not end in May 1945. It continued in isolation, measured by tides instead of commands, by survival instead of ideology. The coastal refuge beneath the cliffs remains preserved today, sealed and protected as a historical site. Visitors see the stone walls, the rusted fixtures, the empty space where a life was maintained just out of sight. There are no plaques offering conclusions, only facts. Someone lived here, someone planned carefully, someone left no explanation behind. For historians, the case is a reminder of how much escapes record-keeping. For investigators, it is a lesson in restraint. Proof does not always bring closure. For the local communities, it confirms what many had suspected for decades. The war lingered longer than anyone admitted. And for the man at the center of it all, the outcome is unknowable. He may have died alone, unseen and unrecorded. He may have survived long enough to see the world move on without him, or he may have chosen an ending that left no trace at all. What remains is a place where history paused, a point where one man stepped outside the systems meant to define him, rank, allegiance, fate, and disappeared into the margins. Not as a myth, not as a ghost story, but as a verified absence. Some war stories end with surrender. Others end with graves. This one ends with silence, and the unsettling understanding that even in the most documented conflicts in human history, there are still people who slip between the lines, leaving behind nothing but proof that they were there, and the question of how they chose to leave.